Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Anxiety and Depression, Understanding Them in Novel Ways. Hikikomori. Hiku, to pull, draw, retreat. Komoru, to shut oneself up, stay inside. Imagine my surprise, nay, my consternation, when, without moving from his privacy, Bartleby, in a singular mild, firm voice, replied, "I would prefer not to." Herman Melville, Bartleby The Scrivener. Hi everybody, and I'm building on the previous video where I introduced this novel by Ivan Goncharov, Oblomov, and I do like my book designs, and I thought this was a great one to depict someone lying in bed, finding it difficult to get on with life. And that's what I wanted to explore today by linking Oblomov, which, remember, is a novel from 1859. I think the first essay, it was a short story that now forms chapter 9 of part 1, called Oblomov's Dream. That was written in 1849, but then he went on to expand it into this whole novel. By 1859 it was published. So you're talking 160 odd years ago, and yet its description of the life of a shut-in obviously has profound relevance to the relatively recent epoch of the pandemic and lockdowns, but more so in contemporary Japan particularly, but also in places like Korea, and to a lesser extent across the rest of the world. There is this notion of the shut-in, or the person who's withdrawn from life. And when I was doing my research into Oblomov, I just looked for modern examples, and I just automatically assumed that Oblomov would be referenced in modern research into the phenomenon of shut-ins. And I would love it in the comments if you could please point out any detailed studies that do compare the two or mention Oblomov, but they're actually few and far between. So this was the edition, or is the edition, I'd recommend. It's a recent translation by Stephen Pearl. And just to repeat, 1859 this came out, and yet its relevance to today strikes me as interesting for a number of reasons I'll explore as we go along. But one immediate thing to observe is that technology, and I'm often someone who blames technology for as much as I possibly can, but technology of the internet, social media and so on wasn't available to Oblomov or Goncharov describing this fictional character. So what I found immediately interesting is the idea that in mid-1800s, this phenomenon of shut-ins could actually be so brilliantly described by Goncharov. And what does that say about the nature of this psychological condition? So it may be the case that technology provides a fertile breeding ground for this type of psychological phenomenon. But I think it's evident from this novel that what Goncharov's describing isn't dependent solely upon the technological conditions. You know, mid-1800s Russia was not suffused with online technologies. So that's one interesting thing. And then there's the... And it's not just me thinking that this is a highly relevant novel. I came across the following, which I thought might interest you. So this is from just a community site that's devoted to book reviews, and a guy called, just a random contributor called Lackmus, did this short review. When I say review, he just made a short comment about having read the book Oblomov. So this is what he said. "I mean, damn, this is hitting close to home, man. I know about the historical, political interpretations of this story, but even if read at surface meaning, it's pretty horrific. As a passive, indecisive person, I can say this is like a death sentence. It's painful to read. It seems like I'm one of the few people who didn't find this book droning or boring. Death sentences can be pretty long, but you are never bored if you're on the receiving end. Now, I don't know whether this Lackmus guy is quoting the death sentences, the last sentence he uses. If it's his, I think it's a brilliantly original statement. And it made me think of what role literature might play in helping people understand the concept of shut-ins. Because as we'll shortly see, the psychological and psychiatric research into the phenomenon is quite vague. It has various diagnostic definitions, but within the psychiatric community, the causes of long-term agoraphobic staying in your bedroom or your house and never leaving, there can be what they call comorbidities. It can coexist with other mental illnesses, but there is a large debate within the psychiatric community about chicken and egg. Does being a shut-in lead to subsequent mental health issues, or do mental health issues lead to the decision to become a shut-in? And I think the causality is quite complicated. But what Lackmus is saying here is it relates, I think, to the concept that I believe in, that literature enables you to process negative emotions and process the concept of loneliness or your psychological condition in a much more healthy way than would otherwise be available. So even if you're on your own reading, it's an interesting form of interiority. It's not the same type of interiority or being inside your own head that is manifested when you're sitting in a bedroom playing computer games or constantly being online. Ironically, although it's highly solitary activity reading, I think it puts you in touch with concepts from the here and now, but more perhaps powerfully, concepts from the past, cultures that you wouldn't otherwise be familiar with. It's a strong psychological resource for putting yourself in places where you otherwise wouldn't go. And in that sense, I think it's a very strong antidote to some of this insularity that is associated with this concept of Hikikomori, the Japanese shut-ins. And I also want to look at there's the Japanese modern phenomenon that I'll explore shortly, but again, written round about the same time as Goncharov's Oblomov, is one of my favourite short stories of all time. This is just a visual depiction, but Bartleby the Scrivener by Herman Melville that I quoted in the epigraph was from 1953. And I think this is a beautiful illustration. The Scrivener part is he's a clerk in a big office, and his catchphrase is, "It became mine just before I left the university sector. I prefer not to." And he basically, well, I won't give you the end away because I'll include it in the description. There's the whole short story of approximately 40 odd pages is available, and I thoroughly encourage you to read it. I think Herman Melville is an absolutely stunning writer, and I think this particular tale prefigures Kafka, who's another favourite of mine, but I think it's much more accessible than Kafka. But it's a very enigmatic, elusive story about a guy whose catchphrase is "I prefer not to." And I won't give the ending away, but it's as you would expect on this channel, it's not particularly cheery. So here's a quote from Bartleby the Scrivener, and it's from not Bartleby himself, who's this minor clerk, but basically his manager within the office. "My first emotions had been those of pure melancholy and sincerest pity, but just in proportion as the forlornness of Bartleby grew and grew to my imagination, did that same melancholy merge into fear, that pity into repulsion. So true it is, and so terrible too, that up to a certain point, the thought or sight of misery enlists our best affections. But in certain special cases, beyond that point, it does not. They err who would assert that invariably this is owing to the inherent selfishness of the human heart. It rather proceeds from a certain hopelessness of remedying excessive and organic ill. To a sensitive being, pity is not seldom pain, and when at last it is perceived that such pity cannot lead to effectual succour, common sense bids the soul rid of it. What I saw that morning persuaded me that the scrivener was the victim of innate and incurable disorder. I might give alms to his body, but his body did not pain him. It was his soul that suffered, and his soul I could not reach. And I thought that was quite poignant because, as I'll shortly go into more depth, the psychiatric literature doesn't have any ready solutions. And obviously, it's not a physical illness. It is a purely mental illness. So what's being described about Bartleby, I would suggest, applies directly to some modern shut-ins. But this is just to give you an illustration. This is called Bartleby the Scrivener. It was an ink sketch by a guy called Leonard Baskin from 1958. And this I'm about to show you is the subsequent piece he did a year later, which I think is quite stunning. So Leonard Baskin, if you want to look it up. And then just to, by way of suggesting that the concept of being a shut-in or withdrawn from society is not, it's quite complicated because Proust, this is a picture of Proust's bedroom. And most people know about the Madeleines from In Search of Lost Time, the biscuit, half cake controversy. But the other one most people have heard of about Proust is the fact he spent his last years in a corked-lined bedroom, and this was it. And his housekeeper was a woman called Celeste Alberet, who said, never saw him write even the shortest note standing up. And he had a biographer, Diana Fuss, who said that he wrote from a semi-recumbent position, suspended midway between the realms of sleeping and waking. So to think that one of, I'd argue probably the best novel ever written, was by a guy who you might suggest would qualify in today's world as one of the Hikikomori. So this is the guy who actually invented the term, and I've seen, please excuse my absolute stunning ignorance of Japanese first names and surnames, because I've seen it Tamaki Sato, but I've also seen it, as you can see on the book, it says Sato Tamaki. So I'm honestly not sure which name is supposed to come first. And like I said, I've seen it put in both different ways. But this was a book, I think it was 1998 it was first published. And I like the subtitle Adolescence Without End, because for a long time, without having this theme to provide a hook, I've thought that one of the things wrong with modern Western society in recent years is that we seem to, as a society, live in a permanent form of adolescence. People are emotionally incontinent. They can't brook disagreement with their points of views. It's whether you're left or right, we live in ideologically riven, aggressive times, and it just seems like the whole of society has given itself over to an adolescent tantrum. But this guy is a psychiatrist, and he developed this concept, which is so he basically created this neologism, this new word to describe the concept of the shut-in, the Hikikomori. And this is an ominous portrayal. The word both describes the condition and the people who suffer from it. And I think that I was reading that the average age of these people has increased. It used to be quite young in the 20s, but the average age now, I think, has moved up to about 32. And this is a screen grab from an anime. I think it's from Welcome to NHK. Apologies if I've got that wrong. But the closeness to the lived reality is quite startling. And this is Hikikomori Sato in an anime called, Welcome to NHK by Tatsuhiko Takimoto. And then regular viewers, I've increasingly started to quote, this is Arthur Schopenhauer, who lived from 1788 to 1860. And, apologies, I just wanted to say that before we go on to the next quote, that more and more I've become interested in Schopenhauer because I'm hoping I've provided a link to the work that I'm going to quote from on the sorrow of the world. And it is remarkable. I think as far as difficult philosophers go, it's one of the most accessible. And I think it's directly relevant to what I'm talking about today, the concept of depression and anxiety, because Schopenhauer's philosophical attitude was that life is about the avoidance of pain. So I think from a philosophical point of view, Schopenhauer provides a brilliant way of thinking about, like I say, just repeat, from a philosophical point of view, not a psychological point of view, but I think from a philosophical point of view, he provides an understanding of why there might be a psychological need to protect yourself from this sense that the world is just a place of pain. So rather than it being an emotional overreaction from people, I think Schopenhauer provides an intellectual justification. So this is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Schopenhauer identifies three main ways in which the intellect breaks free to some degree from the servitude to the will and its attendant egoism. So this concept of the will, the major work of Schopenhauer was The World as Will and Representation. And then he also did The Suffering of the World, which I'm going to be quoting mostly from, but both works relate to his theory of aesthetics. And aesthetics are important for Schopenhauer because he sees the world as being this expression of will as this type of life force, where it's a dog-eat-dog world, so to speak, or as we'll shortly see, an ant-eat-ant type of world. And what aesthetics or art does is provide a temporary relief. It allows us to appreciate the will, the life force, without being subsumed by it, so we can sublimate, we can experience it in an aesthetic form. But this idea of how to free ourselves from servitude to the will, you do it in aesthetic experience and artistic productions, I've just suggested. You can do it with compassionate attitudes and actions. And then interestingly, thirdly, in ascetic resignation from embodied existence. So this would be like the Buddhist type of separating yourself from profane reality and trying to achieve nirvana. But I'd argue that the Hikikomori are doing this third. They're denying themselves exposure to the outside world, and they're pursuing this third angle. But on the suffering of the world, like I say, 1850, and then if you really ever get into Schopenhauer, I thoroughly recommend the Cambridge edition of the complete works. So there's The World as Will and Representation and various miscellaneous other writings. It's about 4 volumes in total, I think. 4 or 5. So on the suffering of the world was 1850, and the world as will and representation was 1818. I think he wrote it, and I'm not sure it came out until about 1819, the year later. But then in 1848, he produced this additional volume that was an expansion. Intellectually, it doesn't give you that much more. It's just an expansion upon volume 1 and the original idea. But to give you a quote from it, to give you a taste of Schopenhauer, and I'm doing all this just to remind you, in order to provide a philosophical context as to why people might want to escape the world. So on the suffering of the world, unless suffering is the direct and immediate object of life, our existence must entirely fail of its aim. It is absurd to look upon the enormous amount of pain that abounds everywhere in the world and originates in needs and necessities inseparable from life itself as serving no purpose at all and the result of mere chance. Each separate misfortune as it comes seems no doubt to be something exceptional, but misfortune in general is the rule. And this is, it's not even a nervous laugh in response. For some truly bizarre reason, and please tell me I'm not alone, I find reading Schopenhauer really relaxing and quite funny, because he just confronts the darkness head on, and I can't read him and be miserable. I just think it's so dark it morphs into something more humorous, but I maybe need to seek professional help. So continuing, I know of no greater absurdity than that propounded by most systems of philosophy in declaring evil to be negative in its character. Evil is just what is positive. It makes its own existence felt. It is the good which is negative. In other words, happiness and satisfaction always implies some desire fulfilled, some state of pain brought to an end. This explains the fact that we generally find pleasure to be not nearly so pleasant as we expected, and pain very much more painful. And just to give you a daft little example, I do find it psychologically accurate what he's just said. I used to play chess competitively, but at a very bad amateur level. And what was interesting was, even the best win that you ever had, I would never remember those or enjoy them as much as I'd fixate on the games that I lost. And that, I don't think that's unusual amongst chess players. We have this proclivity, as he's pointing out, to feel the pain more than the pleasure. The pleasure in this world, it has been said, outweighs the pain, or, at any rate, there is an even balance between the two. If the reader wishes to see shortly whether the statement is true, let him compare the respective feelings of two animals, one of which is engaged in eating the other. This is what I mean. I just think there's a dark humour to the way he writes that maybe is missed, or maybe I'm seeing it where it isn't, or other people are missing it, because lots of other people find him too obnoxious and dark. The best consolation in misfortune or affliction of any kind will be the thought of other people who are in a still worse plight than yourself. You see what I mean? And this is a form of consolation open to everyone. But what an awful fate this means for mankind as a whole. And this reminds me vividly of, I once saw a documentary, I don't know whether I've mentioned this before, forgive me if I have, but there was a documentary about long-living old people who are octogenarians in their 90s or even getting on for 100. So they were in an old people's home interviewing people, asking what was their secret to longevity. And they're all saying such lovely things like, oh, my family, or, looking at the flowers in the morning. And there was one bitter old woman who said that what kept her going and why she was living, I think she was in her late 90s, she said, what's made me live so long is a combination of schadenfreude and spite. So Schadenfreude, the German word for you get pleasure from other people's misfortune, and just good old-fashioned spite. It's what got her out of bed in the morning, kicking her heels. So obviously she probably read Schopenhauer as well. We are like lambs in a field, disporting themselves under the eye of the butcher. You see? Cheery, cheery. Who chooses out first one and then another for his prey. So it is that in our good days, we are all unconscious of the evil fate may have presently in store for us. Sickness, poverty, mutilation, loss of sight or reason. Oh dear. No little part of the torment of existence lies in this, that time is continually pressing upon us, never letting us take breath, but always coming after us, like a taskmaster with a whip. If at any moment time stays his hand, it is only when we are delivered over to the misery of boredom. And that second paragraph there, I think, is highly relevant to Oblomov for two reasons. One is, in reverse order, the concept of boredom is Oblomov's existence. It's his métier. But also the idea that time is continually pressing upon us. I spoke about time in the previous video, and I think it's one of the most crucial aspects of the therapeutic aspect of literature, which I'm going to talk about more in a second, but I think literature enables us to deal with the passage of time. We all are mortal. We all have to face up to our imminent demise, whether sooner or later. And in the face of the infinite, we are insignificant beings. And that can overwhelm people. But literature, I would suggest, enables us to process that mentally and ritualistically in the act of reading and developing a sense of interiority. And it's in Oblomov states at various times, it's a repeated phrase he uses, basically, where do we get the time to live? I think he keeps saying at various points. And that just reminded me of this phrase from Schopenhauer, time is continually pressing upon us, never letting us take breath, but always coming after us like a taskmaster with a whip. He had a brilliant, I just think he's a stunningly good writer. And this is one of my favourite bits. Excuse me. Thus the will to live generally feasts on itself, and is in different forms its own nourishment, till finally the human race, because it subdues all the others, regards nature as manufactured for its own use. This same human race reveals in itself with terrible clearness that conflict, that variance of the will with itself, and we get homo homini lupus, or the idea is Latin for man is a wolf to man. Another way of saying dog eat dog world that we live in. Many insects, especially the ichneumon flies, lay their eggs on the skin and even in the body of the larvae of other insects, whose slow destruction is the first task of the newly hatched brood. The young hydra, growing out of the old one as a branch and later separating itself therefrom, fights while it is still firmly attached to the old one for the prey that offers itself, so that the one tears it out of the mouth of the other. But the most glaring example of this kind is afforded by the bulldog ant of Australia, for when it is cut in two, a battle begins between the head and the tail. The head attacks the tail with its teeth, and the tail defends itself bravely by stinging the head. The contest usually lasts for half an hour until they die or are dragged away by other ants. This takes place every time. And that was from the World as Will as Representation. And it's just one of the several reasons why I never want to visit Australia. The idea of how many animals, I really don't mind the idea of going to New Zealand, because they don't have an inordinate amount of animals spending their every waking moment killing each other or being able to kill you. But this is a bulldog ant. I think it's a queen for those entomologists amongst you. And they really are not very prepossessing little creatures. Yikes. And then if you can keep in mind, I'm now paranoid that the ants looked better than I do. But if you can bear in mind those quotes from Schopenhauer, I'm now going to give you a quote from the same old story. I think he wrote it 10 years before Oblomov. It was an earlier novel by Goncharov. And I think one of the characters' descriptions of his own mindset is quite resonant with Schopenhauer's philosophy. And they're not, I'm trying to think, they're within a few decades. This was written after, only a decade or two after Schopenhauer would have written The World as Will and Representation. But anyway, this is the quote. I desire nothing, seek nothing but peace, the slumber of the soul. I have tasted all the hollowness and wretchedness of life, and I despise it heartily. Whoever has lived and thought cannot but in his soul despise humanity. Activity, cares, worries, distractions, I am sick of them all. I wish for nothing, I seek nothing, I have no aim, for one gains that which one is eager for, and sees that it is all illusion. My joyous days have passed, I have cooled to them. In the educated world amidst human beings, I feel the disadvantages of life too strongly, but alone, far from the crowd, I turn to stone. In this trance anything can happen. I see neither others nor myself. I do nothing and do not notice the actions either of others or myself, and I am at peace. I am indifferent. There can be no happiness for me, and I will not succumb to unhappiness. I just think that's the literary expression of what Schopenhauer's talking about, and also in terms of the Hikikomori. I remember that the translation of the Japanese book about the Hikikomori, that in the preface by the translator into English, the translator's obviously an academic, and not obviously, but was an academic, and they said they were talking about it in class, and one of the students during their office hours told them that they went through a period similar to being a shut-in. So the translator said, well, here's a manuscript I've been translating, I think you'd find it interesting. And sure enough, the student came back and said, I read it, and it was just so accurate to how I felt, and it helped me come to terms with my experience of being a shut-in. And that made me think, I'm not blaming the Japanese author, because I don't think it's reasonable to, for a Japanese author necessarily to know much about Russian literature from the mid-1800s. But I am slightly surprised that this, as I said from the very beginning, there hasn't been this link between Oblomov, who in that novel, Goncharov provides such an accurate description of the mind of a shut-in. And if someone who suffered from the condition, this social withdrawal, the depression, the anxiety, the agoraphobia, all these things that come with it, if they can benefit from reading quite a dry sociological, psychological account of what the condition is, I just think that, I don't know, am I being naive to think that reading a novel that actually provides really accurate insights into the thought processes and the emotional register of being a shut-in, that would also be incredibly valuable, perhaps even more valuable. So it does surprise me, I'm sorry to just repeat it one last time, but it does surprise me that Oblomov doesn't seem to be a resource or a frame of reference, a point of reference for quite a few academic discussions from a psychological and sociological point of view. I don't know why they haven't drawn upon it more often. But from Oblomov itself, so this was 12 years, I think, before Oblomov was published. And I just love the dressing gown as a key, almost a character in itself in Oblomov. Because he spends so much time in it. In Oblomov's eyes, the dressing gown possessed a multitude of priceless merits. It was so soft and supple that it could barely be felt, and yielded with slavish obedience to his slightest movement. At home, Oblomov never wore a tie or a waistcoat because he loved to feel free and unconfined as he moved about. His slippers offered a target so wide, long and soft that even without his troubling to look, his feet were sure to find them every time he lowered them from the bed to the floor. So what Oblomov has done is created a situation of Schopenhauerian comfort. He's trying to avoid pain. And I want to do more work on Oblomov, and I want to go into much more detail because psychologically, Oblomov, I'm not even sure he's in an eternal adolescence. He hasn't left the comfort he felt from his childhood on a country estate in Russia. He felt such safety and comfort with his family that he's never developed psychological independence from that. And whilst Oblomov and the Hikikomori are extreme examples, I'd suggest quite a significant element of what they feel is common to everyone. But this is another quote. This is now a quote from a book. This is a book chapter based upon Oblomov, a critical account. So in the small confines of the Gorokhovaya flat, almost all activities, save those absolutely essential to maintain life, have ceased. I quoted this and got confused in the previous video. So this is from a book chapter about Goncharov, and this particular chapter is about Oblomov. Dust becomes an emblem of the stagnation that has settled upon Oblomov's tiny realm. It is everywhere, on the heavy and graceless mahogany furniture, on the carpets, the walls around the several pictures. Thick layers have coated the yellowed pages of books left open at the point in the past when reading stopped, and lie upon newspapers bearing the dates of other years. And this is the key phrase I'm fascinated by. Time itself seems to have come to a standstill in the Gorokhovaya apartment. The dust has coated the apartment windows, and Oblomov relies upon occasional visitors, not only for news of the outside world, but even to ascertain the time of the year. Don't come near, you are from the cold, he cries out to each of his successive guests, only to be told that it is a beautiful May 1st and that the sun is warm. It's this idea that time's come to a standstill. And Proust is such an amazing writer because he tackles the lifelong passage of time. And Oblomov seems to be in denial. He's created a scenario where time doesn't pass. He's living in an eternal now. The implication being because he can't handle. It's like, you can't handle the truth, to quote Jack Nicholson character. But it's the passage of time is what we all have to deal with. And the Hikikomori, and I forgot to mention it, but I think in the UK, and it's a UK phrase that's gone worldwide, but they're called NEETs, not in employment or education or training. So it's like I should have said this at the very beginning, that's like the Western version of the Japanese phenomenon. But typical of this demographic is staying in your bedroom, blacking out the windows so you don't see the natural passage of light. Whereas Oblomov's using dust and dirt on the windows almost as a prophylactic filter from the reality of the passing of the day and the seasons. This idea that he's not even aware of what season it is at any particular time. Both the outside world and the inner world, larger reality in the confines of his psychic retreat, terrify Oblomov. He fears crowds, movement and bustle, travelling. But the withdrawal to the single room, his blanket and dressing gown bring him little solace. Attacks of nervous terror descend upon him. He fears the very silence he has sought. Supernatural apparitions appear in the dark corners of his room. Clearly a victim of a profound psychological malaise, Oblomov, however, never becomes the object of a clinical investigation. The moments of terror and hallucination return, but essentially Oblomov's alienation, as well as his evolving relation to the larger world, are viewed comically. I think that's true of part one, but the later parts, it becomes much more serious. But I did give little snippets, and I will in future do more. Zarkov, his servant, is just very funny, and I've mentioned in the previous video, the interaction between the two of them is, the suggestion is that Samuel Beckett used it in Waiting for Godot, Estragon and Vladimir. The interaction between those two, the repartee, the dialogue, not going anywhere. The burst stage of Beckett is almost like the description that you get in Oblomov. So I want to just explore this concept of the comic level. The comic level part one corresponds to Eichenbaum's criteria for the grotesque. The style of the grotesque demands that the described situation or event be enclosed in a world of artificial experiences, which is small to the point of fantasticality, that it be completely fenced off from a large reality, and that this be done with neither a satiric nor a didactic purpose, but with the purpose of giving scope to a playing with reality, to break down and freely transfer its elements, so that customary relations and connections, psychological and logical, appear ineffective, and any trifle may grow to colossal proportions. So there's a role for the comic at the beginning of Oblomov, but its wider significance, it goes to the point I was talking before about the infinite. So this idea, which is small to the point of fantasticality. I think there's a phrase, if you want to get something done, give it to a busy person. So there's this idea, I think, if you're in the flow of life, if you're highly competent and practical, you take things in your stride. But if you've cut yourself off, if you've withdrawn from the hurly-burly of life, as Oblomov has, as Nietzsche and the Hikikomori do, then little things become everything. And that's what's being said here, but it's this, the notion of reality becomes disorientated. So any trifle may grow to colossal proportions. But it's italicized there, playing with reality, but with the purpose of giving scope to a playing with reality. And this is where I do think the technological element applies to the Hikikomori. The notion that we live, it was the previous video's theme, the concept of simulation. We live in a society where the sheer volume of hyperreal representations has meant that the normal traditional relationships between reality and the representation has been fundamentally fractured. So you can make a joke of that, which I think in the first part of Oblomov, Goncharov does. But by the end of the book, this breakdown with reality, it's obviously not healthy in the sense that it doesn't lead, it's not psychologically sustainable, which is what happens in the book. And obviously the withdrawn person, the NEET or the Hikikomori's person's way of dealing with reality can't be sustained, or if it is, it's at the price of not living life. But this specific idea of playing with reality, I just wanted to show you, it also links to the comedy, but the relationship of comedy and this dissolution of reality. It reminded me of Don Quixote. This is a Gustave Doré illustration, and I've used Doré before. I think it's absolutely stunning. But this is he's got involved in a fracas in part one of the novel with his friends. There's a barber and he steals his barber's basin, and he claims it's Mambrino's helmet, this helmet of a knight. And they trick him into a cage by telling him that he's enchanted and he can't resist. And he's taken back home because obviously it looks in the illustration that he's having basically almost like a psychotic episode. But Don Quixote is both funny but also directly about this relationship, this strange relationship between the imagination and reality and the comic effect that can have, but also the poignancy. And at the end of Don Quixote, he stops reading, he stops having this hyper imagination. But it's a double-edged thing because he not long after dies, and the implication is that he's a much less interesting human being. His relationship to reality was sustained by his imagination. So this relates to, again, with the concept of needs and the Hikikomori, to what extent is literature and the way it enables, it's a fine line, to what extent does literature enable this sustaining of interiority and psychological health? To what extent does it allow interiority without becoming a pathological condition? But here you have someone like Don Quixote who also lived in books. He wasn't a shut-in the sense he went out on adventures, but also he had a completely disorientated relationship to reality. So as with most things in life, it's getting that balance. But I also think there's a Proust. I mentioned Proust before, as I am wont to do. But from this book chapter by Oblomov exists in a kind of zero present without hope or possibility. In the present, he is a comic curio, clumsily trying to cope with ordinary reality. In dreams, he again finds hope, and he also gains a past, for many of Oblomov's dreams recreate his personal history. Through them, and especially through the several dreams that make up Oblomov's dream, that's chapter 9 from part 1, the novel leaves the flat plane of present time and expands into the history of a life as it passes from childhood to death. See, that's what makes Oblomov just so much more than just, especially in part 1, a comic novel. I did say before, chapter 9 of part 1 was published on its own as a short story, and it became the kernel around which the rest of the novel was eventually built. But this, again, back to this, what I suggested in the previous video about the way in which literature helps you process concepts of time. So Oblomov exists in a kind of zero present without hope or possibility. But it's in his dreams that he achieves some type of psychological security. But that's also the poignancy, and it happens in Proust. The most poignant parts of In Search of Lost Time are Marcel's reminiscences. And towards the very end of the huge 3,000-page epic, there's some stunning passages about looking back. I'll go back to it. In one of the very earliest videos I did, I quoted quite a large section of the end of In Search of Lost Time. And there's a beautiful description of an old man trying to stand up from a couch at a party, and he starts tottering, but he then Proust turns it into this idea of he's tottering on stilts, and while he was sat down he didn't seem that old, but the minute he stood up you got a sense of the tottering over the years. He's teetering on the edge of a long life, and you get this perspective of looking back over time and the constant going back to Marcel's childhood, these memories. Everybody has to deal with that passage of time. And again, just to emphasize, the NEETs or the Hikikomori are living like Oblomov in a kind of zero present. Whether that's to help them not have to deal with that passage of time is perhaps one psychological aspect of it. In defining humour, Coleridge declared that the one humorific point common to all that can be called humorous could be found in a certain reference to the general and the universal, by which the finite great is brought into identity with the little, or the little with the finite great, so as to make both nothing in comparison with the infinite. The little is made great and the great little in order to destroy both, because all is equal in contrast with the infinite. And this is the role of humour, so it may sound slightly odd, but I think I've said it before. Waiting for Godot and other works by Samuel Beckett are actually quite humorous. And it's this part of the humour is the insignificance of Estragon and Vladimir and the endless waiting, the waiting for Godot, this metaphor for the passage of our lives, where all we have is dialogue and somewhat pointless activity. But in future videos, the theme I want to develop is the concept of ritual that I mentioned in the previous video about. The terror of history is what modern contemporary society has to deal with, because we don't have things like epic literature anymore to help us deal with this contrast between the infinite and the little. The mechanisms by which we as little human beings can come to terms with the fact we are nothing in the face of the infinite. Those type of psychological resources that literature and art present, as Schopenhauer suggested, they're an aesthetic form of escape, where we can admire the will, the life force, without being overwhelmed by it. So Oblomov has two lives. He is great in his dreams and little in reality. The infinite in the novel, that which is greater than Oblomov's dreams and circumstances and has the power to destroy both, is the inevitable progress of time. This is what Schopenhauer was referring to, time coming after us with a whip. And I just want to start to round things up, but there's one section of Oblomov where he criticises the concept of the sea, which I found quite interesting, because I want to contrast it with Melville's Moby Dick. And remember, Bartleby the Scrivener was written in 1853, Oblomov's Dreams 1849, Moby Dick was 1851, so they're all very close together. But Melville and Goncharov, they have a completely different approach via at least the character Oblomov of their notion of the sea. But this is what Oblomov says about the sea. It only induces melancholy thoughts. Just looking at it makes you want to cry. The heart shrinks at those boundless expanses of water. In vain does the eye seek relief from the aching monotony, from the spectacle of unending, unendurable sameness. The insensate roaring and thundering of the waves does not soothe our delicate hearing. It just keeps on pounding out that same old, unfathomable threnody that has been pounding out since time began. Wailing and groaning like some monster doomed to endless torment. A chorus of doom-laden voices that cannot be muffled. There is no twittering of birds, only seagulls in the silence of the damned, wheel and circle despairingly over the waters offshore. So he really doesn't like the sea. And it's quite ironic. He wrote a book. I'm trying to think. It's a non-fiction book, but Goncharov, despite being slightly Oblomov-like and not liking travel, he went on a round-the-world cruise. He was the private secretary to an Admiral Putyatin. So he went on completely around the globe on this ship, and did a journal called The Voyage of the Frigate Pallada, or Pallada. So despite having written this via his character Oblomov, he actually did go out and experience the sea. But this is the beginning of Moby Dick, which I thought might make an interesting contrast. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse, and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating the circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially when my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I account it high time to get to sea as soon as I can. It's just quite interesting, Ishmael's antisocial behaviour or feelings, rather than withdraw within a claustrophobic apartment. He withdraws in a different way. He takes himself out to sea. This is my substitute for pistol and ball. In other words, self-harm, taking his own life. With a philosophical flourish, Cato throws himself upon his sword. I quietly take to the ship. There is nothing surprising in this. If they but knew it, almost all men in their degree, sometime or other, cherish very nearly the same feelings towards the ocean with me. So I just think it's interesting. Melville's describing a different approach completely. You confront the infinite rather than obsessing about your own smallness like Oblomov does, or the Neats, or the Hikikomori. Why I find Moby Dick such a brilliant novel is it's a person, Ishmael, with the same tendency, but one who chooses to go out and confront the abyss, the vastness of the ocean. Talking of which, this is a painting from a bit later on, but 1889, The Billowing Sea by Ivan Ivazovsky. And just later on, a few pages after the very opening paragraph, again from Moby Dick, why upon your first voyage as a passenger did you yourself feel such a mystical vibration when first told that you and your ship were now out of sight of land? Why did the old Persians hold the sea holy? Why did the Greeks give it a separate deity, an own brother of Jove? Surely all this is not without meaning. And still deeper, the meaning of that story of Narcissus, who, because he could not grasp the tormenting, mild image he saw in the fountain, plunged into it and was drowned. But that same image we ourselves see in all rivers and oceans. It is the image of the ungraspable phantom of life, and this is the key to it all. So I think it's one of the reasons I adore Moby Dick, the novel, because, again, in a different way to Oblomov, almost the opposite way, because he's not telling us we can keep the sea, but he puts into beautiful literary words this ungraspable phantom of life. It's what Schopenhauer's talking about, the will of life that we have to turn into a representation. And if we're not going to be overwhelmed by the sheer life force of will, we need to find ways to handle it. This is the key to it all. And this is another Ivan Ivzovsky, Among the Waves, 1898. And this is from Oblomov. And thoughts are suddenly kindled. I want to make the link with the sea. And thoughts are suddenly kindled. They move and rush through his head like waves of the sea. Then they grow into intentions. They set all his blood on fire. His muscles begin to move. His veins tighten. Intentions are transformed into strivings. Moved by a moral force, he rapidly changes his position 2 or 3 times in 1 minute. With shining eyes, he half sits up in his bed, stretches out a hand and gazes about inspiredly. A moment and the striving will be realized, and then, O Lord. But look, the morning flashes by. The day already wanes toward evening, and with it Oblomov's exhausted powers decline to rest. Oblomov silently, thoughtfully turns over on his back and, fixing his sad gaze on the window and toward the sky, his eyes mournfully follow the sun, setting magnificently behind a 4-storied house. So this is how the novel works, but so brilliantly. There's stasis, inertia, then the threat of action, and then back to stasis. And that's evident in the passage of the day. So just as Oblomov's thinking about doing something, his exhausted powers decline to rest, and then it coincides with the sun setting magnificently behind a 4-storied house, which reminded me of this painting. It's Sunset at Wheatfield near Arles, 1888, by Vincent van Gogh. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that, and I'll be doing more on Oblomov and whether literature in general can be a resource with which to try and process feelings of anxiety and depression and social withdrawal. But the problem, as I've alluded to with people like Proust, one of the eternal perennial things is that the creative mind, perhaps those who actually produce novels, so maybe it's not so bad for readers, we can develop our interiority and use literature as a resource for all the reasons Schopenhauer implicitly suggests we do, in order that we don't become overwhelmed by the life force. But sadly, I've used this picture before. This was a novelist or short story writer, the Ilya Rypin painted, who sadly did take his own life. And this is the thing about, disproportionately creative people do struggle. So I'll leave you with, it's just I just find it quite haunting. It's why I chose it for the thumbnail. But the haunting face of Gashin. So all the very best.